Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Double Down, the live news and affairs programme that puts people first. It's Thursday the 17th of December 2020. We're broadcasting live from Dundalk and Dublin, and I am your host Finbar Markey. Well folks, it's been 8 episodes over the last 2 months. It's our final episode of 2020, and what a week to end in when the Taoiseach Michael Martin has announced that Ireland did not bail out the banks. The sigh of relief across the country has been audible, or should I say laughable. In the last 8 weeks, we've had some amazing guests with great stories, great insight and great information, and I hope that this week's show will be no different. You may recall that in our opening monologue from last week's show, we spoke about the Venezuelan National Assembly elections. And in that monologue, I quoted an article from Clare Daly MEP, who had been over in Venezuela as an international observer in those elections. Well, we pre-recorded yesterday morning an in-depth exclusive interview with Clare Daly about the Venezuelan elections, but also about democracy in the EU and the increased militarization of the EU as well. Before we actually roll that in-depth and exclusive interview, I'd like to just make a couple of points first. First of all, in relation to a number of comments that were made after last week's show, put up online, and also after our promo that we had out this week, comments that were highly critical of the Venezuelan government. I was going to address some of those comments, but I actually think that we'd be going over ground twice, because Clare Daly does address most, if not all, of those critical comments in her interview. Secondly, I'd like to set a little bit of context for this interview. Last week we spoke about how the United States and the EU were carrying out sanctions, and they were supporting coup attempts in Venezuela against the democratically elected government of Maduro. Well, those sanctions, which have been recorded to kill over 40,000 people in Venezuela in the space of 1 year, those sanctions are not all that's been done to Venezuela. Last year, when Clare Daly was in Venezuela, again on a separate trip, there was an attempted coup attempt by an individual called Juan Guaido. That attempt was not just an internal attempt and a political attempt. There were US mercenaries involved in that. And I'd like to run a clip now from democracynow.org, who covered the involvement of American mercenaries in that coup attempt in Venezuela last year. If you could run that clip for us, please, Stephen.
Incredible story unfolding in Venezuela, where President Nicolas Maduro announced Monday the government had detained 2 former U.S. Special Forces soldiers who took part in a failed coup attempt against him after 10 armed men landed in a boat near Caracas on Sunday. Venezuelan authorities killed 8 of the men, whom they described as mercenary terrorists. 2 men were captured. Speaking from his presidential palace, President Maduro showed U.S. passports for the 2 men, identified as Aaron Berry and Luke Denman. A former Green Beret named Jordan Goudreau has acknowledged the men were working with him and says they attempted to detain Maduro. Maduro accused the U.S. of being behind the plot.
Mike Pompeo was betting on this attack and believed that this attack would end the revolution, end the constitution, overthrow the government, and kill me. God save us and protect us.
The former Green Beret, Jordan Goudreau, runs a Florida-based private security firm called Silver Corps USA. He told the Associated Press 2 Special Forces veterans he fought with in Iraq and Afghanistan were involved in the operation. Goudreau posted a video on Twitter Sunday in which he called the attack Operation Gideon.
At 1700 hours, a daring amphibious raid was launched from the border of Colombia deep into the heart of Caracas. Our men are continuing to fight right now. Our units have been activated in the south, west, and east of Venezuela. Commander Nieto is with me, is co-located, and Commander Sakea is on the ground now fighting.
And so we can see that the pressure that's been put on the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan people is not just internal, but it's not just political or economic either. There are attempts at military interventions to destabilize Venezuela, and this has been happening for quite a long time. So that just sets some of the context for the interview that I conducted and that we're going to run now with Clare Daly MEP. Stephen, if you'd be kind enough to run that interview, please. We're joined this evening by Clare Daly, the Irish MEP, previously a TD for Independence for Change in Ireland. Claire was over in Venezuela recently as an independent observer in the Venezuelan National Assembly elections. The EU High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs has declared those elections essentially null and void, has said they're fraudulent, and that the Venezuelan government made no effort in bringing the people out to vote. Claire Daly was an independent observer. She's written a number of articles since she has returned back from Venezuela, and she thinks that the elections were fair. Hello, Claire, and thanks for joining us this morning, really, as this is a pre-interview.
My pleasure, Finbar. Delighted to see you again, and delighted to give a different version of the events in Venezuela, because we've been really struck by how out of sync with reality the comments of the High Representative of the EU has been on this issue. Just incredible. So I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. Before we get stuck into that, Claire, you're a much missed face in Irish national politics, because you were at the centre at bringing into the Dáil things and corruptions like the Maurice McCabe affair and other affairs, especially around the Gardaí Síochána. Before we start talking about Venezuela, do you find much of a difference between working in the EU as an MEP and having worked in Ireland as a TD?
Yeah, I mean, it's very different. And I suppose the first thing to say would be that the lack of coverage of what goes on in the European Parliament and the European institutions is utterly shocking, because one of the reasons why we stood for Europe was the whole belief and understanding that a lot of decisions are being made in Brussels which are impacting on the lives of Irish people. And we came here to see, could we have an impact on that process? It's been really scary, actually, to see how little coverage is undertaken by the Irish media of what goes on here. I mean, I'm featured in the Bulgarian media, in the British Guardian on a number of occasions about work that I've done here. And I don't think there's been a single article at all at home to cover the work here. So it's different. We're a bit cut off in that sense. But yeah, it's a different type of work. And like, you don't have the same, you know, the Irish Dáil, it's a majority vote. There's a lot of aggro. In the European Parliament, they try to work more on consensus and getting agreement, which is not as good as it sounds, because it sometimes means that, well, you can end up with something that everybody can live with, but, you know, nobody is really mad about. And, you know, in some ways, while you're advancing issues a little bit, you know, it can be a little bit hypocritical sometimes as well, that people sign up to a lowest common denominator and pretend that everything's okay, when actually in other instances it's better to call it out.
Okay, so on the one hand, you're ostracised in the media, or by the media in Ireland, when you were a TD to a large degree, and you're feeling that that's happening. And I think it's obvious, because we don't see what's happening with our MEPs in Europe. And so that process is still happening. And on top of that, the democratic process in the EU is certainly not what our governments would make it out to be.
And we've asked, actually, I've written to, like, obviously it took a while for the new government to be formed, but I contacted the new Minister for Communications, the Greens, Catherine Martin, and basically put out a call that there should be a kind of an Oireachtas TV equivalent for the European institutions that would be on every night or whatever, to allow Irish people follow what's going on. As I said, it's striking when issues come up in other countries that directly impact those countries, or even in general. Their media people are here and the information is going back home. So in that sense, what goes on here is much more live to those countries than it is to Ireland, but actually the impact's the same, because our citizens are being affected by what's going on over here. But I think it's quite deliberate. I mean, obviously RTE are terrible, but I think the Oireachtas TV should step in there.
That sounds like a good idea. Did you get a reply from the minister?
No, none. And I sent her a reminder there again, so I got a little acknowledgement this time saying they're looking into it. But I mean, it would obviously cost money, but it would be money well spent, I think, because it's incredible the amount of issues and how much European integration is moving, actually.
And probably the number of crises that we're seeing at the moment is just going to accelerate that probably as well. Let's get stuck into Venezuela, Claire. You went over as an independent observer. I believe that the EU invited independent observers over, and they did not send any European observers on the elections in Venezuela, and they didn't send any. How did you come about to go over as an independent observer?
Well, I suppose we had been previously in contact with the embassy of the Venezuelan embassy here in Brussels. We had made a trip actually nearly 2 years ago in February 2019. Myself and Mick Wallace had been in Venezuela for an International People's Conference. So we would be known as people who've been outspoken about the Western version or the EU version of what's gone on in Venezuela. So we were directly contacted by the embassy here in Brussels and asked would we be prepared to go over and observe, because they'd previously been in touch officially with the European Union, but the European Union officially declined to observe the elections, which was a bit of a cheek considering that they'd made a trip to Venezuela, say 2 months before that. They'd met representatives of the opposition, all of the opposition. They'd met representatives of the government in advance of these elections, and then they came back and said, no, we won't send anybody. We don't think Venezuela is ready for elections, even though the Venezuelans themselves pointed out that this was their 5th National Assembly election under the new constitution brought in by Chavez in 1999, and that constitutionally they were required to have an election. They had no choice. Come January, their National Assembly was out of time, and if they didn't have an election, no doubt the West and the EU would say, oh, they're breaking their own constitution. So they kind of snookered them either way on that regard. So myself and Mick Wallace and 2 other MEPs went anyway, and there were a lot of other international observers from across the European Union, from civil society groups, parliamentarians from Turkey, from Russia, right across Latin America and from the United States as well. So there was 200 to 300 international observers, which wasn't bad.
The EU High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, came out in a statement last week and said that, as I said in the introduction, that the elections were fraudulent, they didn't meet high standards, and that the Venezuelan government made no attempt to get the population out. There was a turnout, I think, of 34%. You were over there observing. What information do you have, if any, to counter the allegations from the EU Commissioner?
There are so many things that are wrong with his statement. Like, I mean, and actually he knows well that statement is false. I suppose first up, in terms of the procedures themselves, and they were incredibly transparent. And I mean, the important point to make is that these elections came out of a process of about 18 months dialogue between the government and the various opposition parties. So the government recognised that there were some issues that needed to change, and they engaged with the opposition on that. As a result of that, they came up with a new electoral system, a new electronic voting mechanism. They increased the number of seats, so that the National Assembly went from 167 seats to 277 seats. They worked on matrices to go into that electronic system, if you like, based on a breakdown for the parliament between a certain amount of seats going by a national list where you vote for your parties, a certain amount on a regional list where you could vote for a different party or the same party if you liked, and then a local list where the big chunk of them are, you would, like in Ireland, you vote for a person who would be in a political party or whatever. So that process, we got to see it in all its ways. We went to polling stations when the electronic machinery was delivered. We saw it opened up. We saw how the computer said and printed out a message that it hadn't been used before, how that was monitored, signed on, sealed, and then we were spoken through the process itself, which we then got to witness in the following days when the voting took place. So I've never seen anything like it, how sophisticated it was. And given that in Ireland we still use a paper and pen, and that mixed count in the European elections was going to go on for about 6 weeks, when there was a recount, it kind of gives you a scale of what they've been able to engage in. So the computers were bought in India. The process was overseen by most of the opposition parties, and it's important to say, because reading the coverage, you think that there was this big organised boycott and that the government were the only ones standing in the election, and sure they would win then, wouldn't they? Like, that is so false. It's unbelievable that the media in the West would keep coming out with this lie, because it can be totally disproven. There were 94% of the registered political parties in Venezuela participated in these elections, which means 6% didn't. 28 political parties contested, including a number of whom had previously supported Juan Guaido, the self-appointed so-called US puppet. president not, but so some people who've worked with him, even those parties were involved. So 3 political parties weren't, but they weren't even the majority of the opposition. Like, there have been opinion polls done in advance of the election where Juan Guaido's party was on 4%. That'll give you an idea of why he didn't contest the election, because his lie about being the popular leader would have been exposed. So we went through the process, and I mean, it might be a bit boring to talk through the mechanics of the electoral process. Foolproof in terms of electronic ID via fingerprint, with a paper backup of all of the votes, which were audited, and about a 50% sample at the end of the day, with the votes compared, which all of the parties had the right to attend and sign off on. So incredibly transparent. And this idea that there was a big boycott, that sure, the voting was only 31%, so how could it be legitimate? Well, I mean, for starters, this is a National Assembly election, so it's not the presidential election. And in Venezuela, the presidential election is the biggie. So I'm not saying it's like the council elections in Ireland, but it's maybe a little bit, like, it's not as important as the big one, you know. Previously, in terms of turnouts, had ranged from the highest they ever got was the last National Assembly election, where 70% of people voted. So always 30% of people haven't voted. But there was one election in 2009 which 25% had voted. So it wasn't the lowest turnout ever, but obviously it was a bit disappointing. But there's a couple of points I'd make on that. First out, well, people are fed up with politics everywhere, you know, and there is a demoralization, and Venezuela isn't any different than that. We've had COVID, which has meant that, like, there was an election in Bulgaria on the same day, and they got the same turnout roughly, and I didn't see High Commissioner Borrell giving out about that. So, you know, they had, so COVID impacts, demoralization impacts. In terms of Venezuela, millions of people have been forced to leave the country because of sanctions. So some of them are obviously on the register, but they weren't there to vote in any case. So that had to be factored in. There was a call from some people to boycott the elections. We didn't sense that all that much, to be honest. The biggest rallies that were there were in favour of the government, but maybe say about 10% of people boycotted. We'd be generous, you know what I mean? Maybe so. And then you add in the sanctions. So when you add in all of that, actually, it's not that bad.
Let's try to get to the nub of the problem here, Claire. First of all, when it comes to the democratic aspect of Venezuela's recent history, my understanding of it is that Hugo Chavez initially, almost on his own, took a tank into the presidential palace in, I think it was 1992. He did 2 years in jail, but lots of people came out in the street in support of some kind of democratic change. He didn't want to participate in elections back then because he believed that they were fraudulent. He eventually was convinced to do so and won, I think it was 60-something% at the time. It was a significant win for him. And from then, one of the emphasis, from my understanding of the Venezuelan government, is to have as pure a democratic process as possible, and hence the development over time of these electoral systems. But if we want to get to the nub of the problem, why do you think, since the Bolivarian Revolution, as it was called, in the late 90s in Venezuela, we've had sanctions, we've had embargoes, we have had an international campaign to destroy the image of successive democratic elected Venezuelan governments. We never have a situation where there are people suffer from hunger, there's mass immigration out of the country. What's it all about? Why is the international community, including Ireland as a part of the EU, doing this, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's so embarrassing. And I mean, it's precisely because, I suppose, of the beacon of an alternative put out there by the Bolivarian Revolution and Chavez's attempt to go a different path. They're being punished because they've stood up to US imperialism. They are the world's wealthiest oil country, but they can't access their own resources now because of the impact of sanctions. Means they can't refine the oil, although Iran is trying to help them in that at the moment. But because they had the audacity of talking about trying to develop a different type of, you know, they might have called it socialist or Chavismo, whatever. It was anti-imperialist and independent, and the US couldn't have that. So the US then embarked on a series of international sanctions, many of them unlawful, and shamefully, the EU followed suit. They recognised that unelected puppet Juan Guaido, who appointed himself as a so-called president, which is utterly without any foundation in international law. And you made the point, and you're right, Finbar. I mean, we were struck, like we had a meeting with the Attorney General, and we were struck with how much the Venezuelans put an emphasis on the law and upholding the law and their constitution, which was devised in 1999 by Chavez. They have 5 different institutions which balance off each other: the presidency, the electoral council, the National Assembly, the judiciary, and so on. And it's very participative and inclusive, and written down in and easily understood. So yeah, they're being punished because they've stood up to a different way and challenged US economic interests in the region, who want to see Latin America as just a pool that they can pilfer from, as they've done in the past. And I suppose as well, because Chavez, a little bit like Simón Bolívar, who was the revolutionary who freed 6 Latin American nations from Spanish colonialism, that Chavez reached out to the other countries in Latin America, and that's where it's dangerous. And you know, I was struck by the fact that when we were in Venezuela, former president of Ecuador, Correa, was there, Evo Morales was there, and we all know what happened in Bolivia last year, who had fair elections as well. There was basically a coup against the government in Bolivia, but a year on, there's been other elections, and the Morales party are back in. So there's only so much they can do, but I was struck by how that idea of Latin America and Southern American solidarity, which Venezuela has kind of championed, is coming back in, because they've withstood everything. If you said sanctions, everything, and they're still standing, which is a miracle in and of itself.
Yeah, in the 1980s, I remember the only reason I enjoyed religion class in primary school and in secondary school was because it was the time of liberation theology, this mixture of Christianity and independent, almost revolutionary politics in Latin and South America. And so it's something that has permeated into our culture, and that could be one of the principal dangers that certain interest groups might see. You were in Venezuela in 2019 when there was a coup attempt by Juan Guaido, supported by external forces. Can you recollect for us any of the events that you witnessed, or any of the conversations you had with people around Guaido and what was happening?
People just thought it was ridiculous, you know. I mean, obviously there were tensions there. We were after the time when they were on the board, when Juan Guaido had assembled on the border of Colombia, and there was talk of an invasion coming in, and under the guise of so-called humanitarian aid, which you had the likes of that Aegis, Richard Branson, doing a big concert on the border. And it turned out then that the humanitarian aid was actually weapons being trying to get across the border. So the Venezuelans were dead wide to what was going on there. When we were there, they were mobilizing their citizens. The army and the military have a very high standing amongst the population in Venezuela. There was an attempt in the Western media to kind of say that the army was split and half of them wanted to go with Juan Guaido. That certainly wasn't the case. And interestingly now, the attitude was maybe at that time that Maduro's government may or may not have survived. But the opinion polling now is that very much people believe that the Maduro government will continue. So we met a lot of people, a lot of volunteers who do army training, who had been, and they say they've about 1 million citizens who go and do training for the military, who are prepared to be mobilized to defend their country should there be an external military invasion. But, you know, I think it's gas. You hear all this talk about Maduro being a dictator and all the rest of it, but here you have Juan Guaido calling for military intervention, basically sedition. And he's still walking around freely, like, you know. You have newspapers in Venezuela which run with headlines like, you know, Maduro, go away, like, you know, please come in, invade our country. And everyone lets them peddle that nonsense. It's hardly a dictatorship, like, you know what I mean? Of course, there's people who don't like Maduro. I don't like Michal Martin. I happen to think he's doing a crap job. But it doesn't mean I think that Ireland's a dictatorship, you know? It's just crazy.
In terms of the sanctions, you were there in 2019. You're just back from Venezuela again. The sanctions appear to be designed to pressurize the Venezuelan people into some sort of civil war, or at least some revolutionary act based on the idea that their government is failing them rather than the sanctions are impacting them. What impact are the sanctions having on everyday life for Venezuelan people?
Well, you're totally right that that's what they're doing. And interestingly, in a reputable poll done there recently, 65% of the people said that the sanctions hurt the people. 17% said they hurt the government, but everybody believes they hurt the people, which they do. So I suppose the first thing that struck us compared to the last time we were there is that the currency has basically disappeared. You will not see the currency anywhere. It's gone. It's utterly useless. The exchange rate now is $1 is 1 million bolivars. 1 million, like you couldn't even, so they don't print money anymore, and all the prices are basically in dollars. The average wage is about $4 million bolivars a month. So that's $4 a month. So people are going to be saying, well, how in God's name could people survive on that? Well, interestingly, the Chavez government and Maduro after them, they developed about 3 million units of social housing for starters in the midst of a crisis and, sanctions and all the rest. So there might be a lesson for the Irish government in that one. But basically, people don't pay rent. They're accommodated, so they don't pay rent. The government provides a kind of a box of essential services every month. There's about 8 million families in receipt of that now, so they'd be basically basic foodstuffs. You don't pay on the metro, nobody pays. I mean, there is what you see, and one of the biggest differences is the shortage in gasoline. So there are massive queues. Like, it reminded me years ago being a kid during the OPEC oil crisis, when the petrol stations in Ireland, people used to be queuing for hours. So the petrol stations have giant queues all the time. But interestingly, what they're queuing for is that, like, the price of a litre of petrol is 0.001 cent. So you fill your car for 6 cents. So, it gives you an idea of the thing now. But wealthy people can pay a bit dearer. They pay about 50 cents a litre, and they can kind of jump the queues by doing that. So the queues so life is obviously difficult. And in some ways, people are doing a lot of casual work, a lot of kind of barter in some of the areas and the barrios. They're redeveloping, sort of trying to do urban horticulture to meet their food needs or whatever. I think the biggest impact has been on medically in terms of the sanctions, people missing out on healthcare. Interestingly, they did very well in terms of COVID. And one of the reasons why they did was they understood that if there was a COVID crisis, their hospitals absolutely would not have been able to withstand it. And it is a point that they made, which is true, that they were very grateful to get the support from the Chinese, from the Cuban doctors and so on, which other Latin American countries refused, the sort of friendly American ones, who were still offered those services. And the COVID rates in those countries compared to the likes of Venezuela are just shocking. So they actually did really well with COVID, and we were really impressed with the amount of masks being worn. There wasn't much social distancing, but there had been a lockdown which had only been released kind of for Christmas. So there was a huge amount of people out in the streets and everything, but they were all wearing their masks and that kind of thing. So life is hard. I think it's easier to be poor in a warm country. I don't mean to be smart by that, but do you know what I mean? They're getting by. And it was Christmas, and Venezuelans love Christmas. Like, so it was hopping. Like, I've never seen as many Christmas lights, the kind of markets where all the people were out and about, and I'm talking about the ordinary people. These weren't wealthy people, and they were just getting on with life the same as everyone else. And the idea that, this is some sort of dictatorship where they're all living in terror is just an utter nonsense. They would love to have a better freedom to get on economically, and that, and there's no doubt loads of people have emigrated because of the economic hardship, but a lot of people are just getting on with it.
You met members of the opposition over there, and you already briefly mentioned that the majority of the opposition partook in the elections and were willing to enter into the contest and accept the results of the contest and saw it as fair enough anyway. In terms of what the opposition that you've spoken to feel about what's happening from external agencies such as from sanctions, coup attempts, how do they feel about much of this?
Well, that's the difference. You see, that is the difference between the opposition who contested the elections and the Juan Guaido opposition, who are not Democrats at all. They're in many ways violent thugs in the party of Leopoldo Lopez and that, who are not interested in democracy at all, who are kind of racist, like they're kind of, against the indigenous people and that type of thing. So, yeah, most of the opposition who contested the elections do not want intervention, and they do not want sanctions. They want the right for Venezuela to dictate its own affairs. They'd like to see Maduro out of power. They'd like to be in power themselves, but they want to do that democratically in accordance with the constitution. Most of them would feel, and they're right, that their biggest problem really is that they're disorganised. Now, anytime you have an election, the sitting government is going to be better organised. They're the ones who can kind of access resources better. But the biggest problem for the opposition is the parties were too split. So when the West says that Maduro's party won 67% and so on, and that they were the only people standing or that kind of thing, that's just not true. There were actually 9 parties in an alliance with the government. So they all managed to come together on the platform. So obviously they get more. The Communist Party last time round were in that alliance, but they split because they weren't happy with the way in which it was run. So they were kind of a left opposition, if you like, and they stood on their own. They got about 3%, which is pretty good for a single party. But the other sort of other opposition and the sort of right-wing opposition, for want of a better word, were very disorganised. So you didn't have a grouping that would have had, say, 9 parties coming together. You had a lot more smaller groupings. So they were kind of eaten into their own spaces. And one of the problems they have, and they know it themselves, is that they don't have a person or a character who can mobilise and enthuse the population. So there's no enthusiasm amongst the population for the opposition. There isn't a huge enthusiasm amongst a lot of them for the government either, you know. While you find that Chavismo is popular still, and that idea, there is a lot of demoralisation with the government. And probably Maduro came to power when oil prices were plummeting. You've had the sanctions in. It's been a tough time, but, you know, he doesn't have the charisma really of Chavez either. So a lot of people would be, you know, maybe not enthusiastic, but they're definitely, you know, more behind the government, and they certainly would rally behind them if there was a serious threat to undermine that government, for sure. So I think the task for the opposition now, and they know it, is to try and get a figure or a person who personifies a democratic opposition, like, you know, but they haven't got that person yet. So I think they're kind of looking in that direction to the next presidential elections. And if they did that, they'll definitely make grounds on the government, no question. If they got their act together, they would make space on that.
I think Maduro was proof of social mobility in Venezuela. I think he was a bus driver, if I recall correctly, and ended up becoming the president. Within the political structures of the EU, Claire, not necessarily the actual administration of the EU, but the actual elected political structures, is there a pushback against the official response to the elections by the EU High Commissioner? You mentioned 4 MEPs that went over as independent observers. Is there more than 4 MEPs that are questioning the official version from the EU on this?
Yeah, there's obviously more than 4, but you know, the 700 MEPs, there certainly isn't 400, that's for sure. And one of the things, and we discussed it with the Venezuelans, and it's interesting you made the point about Maduro being socially mobile. The leaders of Venezuela are incredibly accessible. Like, they were very worried about our security because they thought there might be an incident to discredit the elections. But we had a meeting with Maduro. The foreign minister came to events with the election observers, sat around and discussed honestly with activists and the problems that they were facing. The vice president did the same. There's no airs and graces in their interaction with the people who were there organising the events. It was much more, I don't know, their leaders, for want of it, are much more accessible. There was a really nice tone around that. But in terms of recognition here, I mean, Leopoldo Lopez, the leader of Juan Guaido's party, who was imprisoned for violent incitement, where people in the unrest in 2017 and so on, where people lost their lives, where in the affluent districts of Caracas, some of the opposition organised the most appalling brutality, including putting steel wire across the road, and which ended up decapitating people on motorcycles and so on. There was really horrible violence. He was imprisoned. He's currently in exile in Madrid, but his father is an MEP, one of the groups. So anything that gets mentioned on Venezuela at all, doesn't matter what it is, he's down on it like a ton of bricks. That's his only narrative. In the Spanish media, every single day, Venezuela is mentioned. Last year when we were over, Maduro joked about the fact that if he stood for election in Spain, which he has a right to, because a lot of Venezuelans do, which if their ancestors were Spanish and all of that, that he would have got elected because he was better known than most Spaniards. But that's actually true. So there's a daily account of Venezuela, and the Spaniards in the European Parliament nearly sit on that and don't want to crush that narrative. So generally the left group obviously would be supportive of Venezuela. Interestingly, actually, I think High Representative Borrell, kind of foreign minister of the EU, as it were, who is Spanish, was trying to make some overtures. So there's talk there, but actually the minute he did that, he was jumped upon by the right wing, and I don't honestly think that his efforts were that great anyway. But he even putting a little toe in the water, he got belted back. So look, it's very obvious, and interestingly, I believe there are reports done of the Council of Europe, which is all the heads of state, looking around and discussing now what's going to happen. And there are very different views between the countries, because the EU has made a holy show of itself by the majority of countries recognising Juan Guaido, and now they're looking at a scenario of what to do afterwards. Publicly, they still endorse him, but the dogs on the street know whatever happens. One thing we can say with 1,000% certainty is that Juan Guaido will never be president of Venezuela. He will never be anything in Venezuela. He is playing at being a computer president, really, with no basis in Venezuelan society. And I think the EU begin to recognise that. But how do they abstract themselves from that scenario when this Egypt has gone around Europe? Because we should remind ourselves that a lot of the EU countries are culpable in holding on to the assets of the Venezuelan people in bank accounts. We saw a case in the UK, but also in Portugal and in other countries. There's billions of resources which the Venezuelan government have tried to access to bring home to look after their people, and they've been blocked in that. And actually, Juan Guaido has gone to those courts and tried to get that money for himself. Luckily, the judiciary of Europe so far have blocked him in that and said, well, let's see your credentials. I know you say you're the president of Venezuela, but, and that some of your friends in America think you are, but could you give us the proof of that? And obviously he can't,
What responsibility for this and for what's happening in Venezuela, how much responsibility could be weighted upon the shoulders of the Irish people collectively as much as their European partners, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this previously with Simon Coveney, and their attitude kind of was that Ireland was kind of last in line in recognising Guaido, which he kind of said, look, we did kind of hold up, but it was more or less like he was saying we didn't want to be the only ones left out. But I mean, they weren't, because certainly Italy didn't recognise them, and I think Greece did, and there was another country, I can't remember who they were, which meant that the EU formally didn't recognise them, thank God. But actually, Ireland went along with that, which is pretty bad. But that's not the Irish people's fault. I mean, I suppose as Irish people, all of us should. But how do you, unless you've access to alternative platforms like yours here, or that people use social media, and that they're not going to get an accurate version of what's going on in Venezuela from the mainstream media. I mean, it's a totally normal, peaceful country where the government is legitimate. No question or doubt about that. That's not to say everybody thinks they're the best government since sliced bread, but they won the election fair and square.
Okay.
I suppose, look, we're as culpable as anybody else. I think the EU is very culpable, because we have a responsibility to develop an independent foreign policy separate to what the United States does. And really, they've embarrassed themselves by just going along with that.
Okay. One final question, Claire, and just pulling back to EU politics for a minute. At the beginning of the show, you said that you felt that there was no key issues that are discussed in Europe being reflected in the Irish media. If I asked you to identify 2 or 3 key issues that are not being reflected in Irish media and that we could talk to you again sometime about, hit us up with them now. What should the Irish people be looking? What's happening now in Europe?
The first thing, which is utterly scary, is the increased militarisation of the EU. And even against the backdrop of COVID and so on, we now for the first time have the funding of the European Union being used directly for military expenditure through the European Defence Fund and a whole number of others. I mean, we take the programme, there's so many of them, the European Peace Facility, which is not about peace at all. The transport budget is being used for military mobility. The education budget is being used for military developments and technology and so on. So that's absolutely huge. I think the whole issue of migration as well, because you have the Parliament being dominated by I suppose, an arms industry that is milking the system for all it's worth, creating wars in countries, and then the refugees who come from those wars, the same companies benefit from the big contracts to keep them out in terms of border security and so on. So that's certainly an interesting area where that money is going. I think that's a biggie. I think there are obviously moves to have some sort of a consolidated tax base across the EU, which is an interesting one as well. Clearly, I'd like to see the multinationals paying their taxes. They're getting away with murder, and they should be coordination. But for countries like Ireland, who our economic policy is nearly based on being a tax haven, that's going to be an interesting one. And how we balance our national sovereignty with the idea of trying to make things better. Other than that, I think, it's something that we deal with on a daily basis, is the utter hypocrisy between this nonsense being spouted by the EU about European values and so on, and then the disconnect between that lie and the real lives of European citizens, this is a neoliberal project, and the neoliberal economic agenda, which has been foisted at the behest of big pharma, big agri, all of that should be certainly looked at, because they talk about having environmental programs and dealing with climate change. It's a fraction of the money that they're dealing with on that as they're dealing with on militarism and so on, and then their economic policy as well, giving greater inequality across the EU. So all of those things are carrying on a pace. Now, the pace of the European Union is very slow, so maybe that's why they inch along. But this is inching in a certain direction, and Ireland isn't even talking about it, which is scary.
Claire, a good long interview, not a mention of Brexit, and I think we'll stick to that for now. Claire, I really appreciate you coming on. The viewers really appreciate you coming on. I hope to have you back in the new year to talk about some of those issues and try to develop platforms that link us to what's happening in the EU, because at the moment we're connected so much with the EU in so many ways. They dictate our policies to us, and yet it's like there's a curtain between us and themselves. So I'll talk to you into the new year. You have a happy Christmas and a happy new year, Claire.
You too, Finbar. Thanks a million for having me.
Talk to you soon.
Take it
bye-bye.
easy.
Bye-bye. That was an exclusive interview that we recorded with Claire Daly early yesterday morning. I'd like to, just at the end of this show now, just focus in a little bit on that democratic deficit within the EU. But before I do, I just want to pass comment on some comments that have been made in the comment box whilst Claire Daly was talking and that interview was rolling. I and our production team have no issue with people contradicting, with information and links and things like that, contradicting what our guests are saying. But hate speech and calling our guests names is just not on. It's not going to be accepted by the production team or by me. We're about informative discussion and debate here. If you want to counter the information that Claire Daly or any guest is giving, please do so in a respectful way. We will not tolerate hate speech and nasty comments that are making fun of guests in a horrible way. It just won't be acceptable on the show. I just want to focus in a little bit on the end of that interview with Claire Daly for a minute, and the idea that on the one hand we are essentially ruled by the EU, and yet there's a complete lack of connectivity in terms of the Irish people feeling they have any say or involvement or franchise in the European political project. I have a video here from a couple of years ago of Clare Daly's MEP colleague, Luke Ming-Flanagan, at a debate that was hosted by Vincent Brown, just discussing that very subject. If you could roll that for me, please, Stephen.
Opinion polls show that trust in the EU is spiralling downwards. In an attempt to reverse this trend, the public are now being treated to brainwashing through, well, what's called the Blue Star programme, running in our schools. I was invited to raise that lovely flag at one of my local schools lately. I refused. It's an abomination. It's not about fairness. It does our kids no good. The European People's Party's election manifesto, which Fine Gael, remember, says we need education in the schools around Europe. Such education will be used to counteract ignorance. You see, if you don't agree with the EU, you're thick and you're stupid. We're ignorant. And it's to get rid of growing Euroscepticism. Now, if the EU was of such benefit to Ireland, why do we need to go into our classrooms and brainwash our kids and tell them we'd still be living in caves if we didn't join this union? I'll finish by saying this. If it's fair, can you tell me why the guy who's at the head of it said this? I'm ready to be insulted as being insufficiently democratic, but I want to be serious. I am for secret, dark debates. Well, all I can say is my children ain't going to be brought up in that new super state, and we've got to bring it down.
That was Luke Ming Flanagan, MEP, talking about the democratic deficit in the EU a couple of years ago. I'm looking forward into 2021 to cover a number of topics in relation to the EU and Ireland's connection with the EU. Venezuela, and talking about Venezuela tonight, was one of those topics because Ireland does not lead its own foreign affairs anymore or make its own internationally based decisions anymore. That's done on our behalf by the EU, and we essentially have to follow in tow with anything that the EU are doing. And that in itself is another sign of our democratic deficit at the moment. So that's why I felt it was important that we look at Venezuela from the EU angle, but also from the angle that there's lots of talk about people in Ireland wanting radical change and around the world. But accompanying radical change can be the pressures, like the pressures that are placed on Venezuela and countries like that. And when I say radical change, I don't necessarily mean voting in a socialist government or anything like that. But even, for instance, the discussions around taking control of our own national resources, which is what the Venezuelan government did in the first decade of the Venezuelan or Bolivarian revolution. Though they still allowed private companies to manage everything, they increased the national take on oil via taxation. So just to be aware that when independent nations make decisions that go against the grain of international finance, this is the kind of thing that can happen. And so it's important that when we do have discussions about change and radical economic change in terms of our sovereignty, things like that, we must be aware that there are international forces that will try to stop us at every turn. Okay, folks, it's the end of the year. I want you to have a really happy Christmas. You may not have very much in your pocket, but smile and be happy. I think that we're here and we're surrounded by family and friends if and when we are, and that we enjoy that time that we spend together. I look forward to 2021. I look forward to many more episodes of Double Down on the National Inquiry. I'd like to thank Stephen McDowell and Michelle McDowell here in our Dundalk studio, Stephen Kerr and Danny Padagier in our Dublin studio, and I look forward to seeing you next year. Happy Christmas, folks. Night, night.